she's going to turn away from me. If I get her pointing in the right direction, now I apply pressure there, I'm behind that point of balance, I can push them. My girls, turn around. So using that point of balance to speed up or to slow down my animals. So if I want to speed them up, I move into that, go in the opposite direction. Want to slow them up, get in front of that point of balance. So it's kind of like Temple Grandin describes it as a bubble. When you push that bubble in one place, it's going to go to wherever you want it to. So what did I do wrong there? I got in front of that heifer's point of balance and she turned around on me. So now these heifers are probably a little stickier than a lot of them that you'll work with, you know, for sure. But when we talk about flight zone and that point of balance, that really is something that you have to evaluate as you go in and working with whatever bunch of animals that you have. For some of our, you know, like our desert cows and stuff like that, that see people a few times a year, that flight zone may be a quarter mile away, right? I mean, you've all seen that. Working with old show heifers, those are some of the most difficult ones that I work with, some of my son's old show heifers, because they have absolutely no flight zone. And then within these groups, you have different varying degrees of flight zone. So, and then one of the final things, or the other concept that Dr. Gill talks about in his 5 points. Number one, cattle want to see you, cattle want to go around you, cattle want to be with each other. They want to relieve pressure. The other important thing to remember is that cattle can only think of one thing at a time. And there's actually even research. How many of you are multitaskers? So what really happens is you're not really multitasking, but some people are better from switching from one task to the other. But in reality, we as humans can only think of one thing at a time. Now I know, like a lot of people do, you know, text and drive or whatever they're not supposed to do, but you know, I mean, we think we're multitasking, but we switch from one to the other. So that's especially apparent in cattle. is that they can only think of one thing at a time. So if we remember that, if I'm putting pressure on them, I want them to be kind of hooked onto me, that they're responding to what I'm asking them to do versus all of the other distractions. So, you know, when I brought those heifers back up here in the corner, there were a lot of other distractions, and so I kind of lost them just a little bit again, but they can only think of one thing at a time. So those are kind of your real basic principles of animal handling. So when you think about in terms of safety, there's some things in there that kind of correlate there. You know, especially thinking about flight zone. You know, again, I talked about the most dangerous animal being one that's alone. That's really something that you need to pay attention to and be aware of, especially if you have people that are helping you that aren't aware of what you're doing. Well, also one other thing about vision is that there's some pretty good research that shows that differences between left eye and right eye, how cattle pick you up. So cattle try to pick you up, if they can, if they have a choice, with their left eye. The left eye is tied more closely to the emotional part of the brain, the more the fight or flight instinct part of the brain. Okay? So the left eye is tied more to that emotional, that fight or flight instinct. And so when cattle pick you up, they try to pick you up with that left eye because that's their natural prey response. The right eye is tied more to the analytical part, the more the processing centers of the brain. And so again, in designing your facilities and thinking about that, there's some different things that to kind of keep in concept there. Do cattle hear very well, or do prey animals or grazing animals hear very well? They do. They certainly do. And it's kind of neat. You ever, you know, those of you that have been on, you know, horseback or seen cows, they have a really kind of cool ear. They can raise their ear, they can lower their ear, and have one forward, one back. They can kind of pay attention to a couple of different stimuli at the same time, even though they can't process, you know, they're going back and forth, but they can really use auditory signals. And there's actually been some research that shows that that cattle are more responsive or more in tune to voices than they are to stuff like gates clanging, to inanimate objects and like that. And so again, that's something that we can use. So but the basic, probably the most important thing to remember is that pressure, how we apply it, and how we release it. It's really important to think about as we're going around and moving these animals around. So, any questions so far, or anything that I've said is just flat BS, or?
So when you're working cattle, you prefer to go on their right side?
You prefer to, but again, just like everything else, you train them. You know, just like like your horse. You know, you're saddling on the left side, and you know, when you introduce new stimuli, that's you know, it's better to introduce it on the right side if you can. You know, when you're first starting, but you get them accustomed and you get them acclimated to that on both sides. So like these heifers have been worked, you know, quite a bit. You know, so it'd be different if I had a set of, you know, F1 Brayfords in here that, you know, we just pulled right off of, you know, Deming country or something. There'd be a little difference there, but
The chutes would be facing
right,
to bring them in.
right,
Where your work, most of your work's done on the right.
correct. And your bud box would maybe be set, you know, opposite of this, to where you're bringing them in, you know, the opposite way up into the chute, to where you could apply that pressure where you keep them a little calmer. You know, and again, that's a very subtle difference. You know, and as you work with your livestock, you're going to kind of get them accustomed to that, you know, and acclimated to that, you know, to that. But yeah, that's one of the concepts that Temple Grant and some other researchers have kind of found out, that there's different ways that they process depending on the eye. So kind of a neat deal. Do cattle remember? Do cattle think? I don't know if they think, but they do express different types of reactions for sure. And cattle do remember. Do horses remember? Absolutely. Absolutely. So if a cow or heifer or whatever we're working with has a bad experience somewhere, she's going to remember that forever. Now, we can get them kind of through that, but I'm sure you've had cows that have had a bad experience in a chute that, maybe they go up in the race or the lead up all right, but getting in that chute is a problem because they remember a bad experience or something that was painful there. So cattle remember for a long time. I think Craig talked about it yesterday, and one of Temple Grandin's stories was talking about a guy with a black hat that they associated somebody with a black hat had abused a horse, or I think it was a horse, wasn't it? That had abused a horse, and they automatically became agitated when they saw somebody with a black hat. There was that association there. That same person, if they put on a ball cap or a straw hat or something, they didn't have that same reaction. So there's very, very good memory that cattle have. The other one is smelling. How tuned in is smelling in cattle or grazing animals? Yeah, it's pretty tuned in. Probably not as much as hearing or vision, but Temple Grandin also talks about a story where, again, some horse had been abused by somebody that was drinking, and so when they had somebody approach with alcohol in their breath, that horse became agitated, really became wired up, amped up, versus not having that. So there's those associations. So they're a lot smarter than we probably give them credit for. Again, when we go back to that basic cattle handling and stockmanship, we talk about low stress cattle handling, and I'm probably like some of you. That's kind of hippie stuff, right? Kind of new age, feel good kind of stuff. But the more I study it and the more I am around it and implement these practices, the more I realize it's really kind of the right thing to do, and it makes my job a lot easier. Low stress cattle handling does not necessarily mean low pressure, and that's a big misconception of low stress cattle handling, because there's times when we have to put a significant amount of pressure when we want to get them to do something. Okay, so low stress cattle handling does not always mean low pressure, but it's a proper application of that pressure. There's going to be times when we really need to get after them to get them to do what we want, but that relief of that pressure, when they do what we want, that's when we relieve that pressure. So those are some of the basic concepts. What about you're in wolf country, right? What differences do you see in handling those cattle versus cattle that aren't in wolf country?
Have a lot more trouble using dogs.
Right.
It's almost impossible to use a dog anymore.
Absolutely, yeah. Because they've developed that fear of dogs, and in fact, I think in wolf country you'll see cows that will attack those dogs, especially those older dogs. So again, every situation is different, and you've got to kind of adjust to that and do those kind of things. What about flags or paddles? How many of you use flags or paddles or hot shots? How many of you will admit that you use hot shots? So what is a flag or a paddle doing?
Just give them something visual to move away from.
Right. So you're extending your reach where you can put pressure on them, right? I mean, that's basically what a flag or paddle does. One of the things I think that's pretty interesting, we start thinking about going into being in the food business is, a lot of the BQA recommendations, and so forth, talk about, eliminating the use of hot shots or prods. If you really think about it, though, there's some cases where it's certainly appropriate to use a hot shot. If you got something down, you stop at the gas station, you're hauling a load of cattle to sale barn or something, you've got something down, you're not going to get a cow up, with a flag or by reaching through there. You got something that's balking in your race or your lead up. Is it more humane and better for that animal to give them a little stimulus with a hot shot, or to sit there and try to twist a tail and inflict more of that pain? Again, I leave that kind of up to you, but I think there's an appropriate use and an appropriate place for a hot shot, and so forth. But again, use it judiciously, because I've also been, I also do a lot of AI work. I've also been on places where that's the first option before even stepping in a corral is a hot shot. And so there's certainly a balance there and so forth. What other problems or issues are you seeing in handling cattle? What are some of the challenges that you see?
We need to get more
Yeah. Where do you see most of your slow up or your balking at?
So it depends on the facility, right?
Absolutely.
So, you know, you might speak to just design, is the pen too big, too small, that kind of thing.
Right.
Would be the biggest challenge, people handling them, if they're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right. Yeah, you're either late or you're too quick. Right. You know, in most cases, we're late to be in the right place to put the right amount of pressure, and that causes a lot of problems for us in getting cattle turned around. The other thing when driving cattle, you know, and especially here, and you'd see that when those cows are all pointed in different directions, because cattle want to kind of know where they're going, right? And so if I try to drive these out of this corner and I try to do that and apply too much pressure when they're all facing different directions, they're going to do like they did right there. They're going to go in different directions. They're going to go in the direction that they're pointed. But if I take a little bit of time, get them all pointed the right direction, then it's a lot easier for me to move them. So again, I'm having problems here because they're all pointing in different directions. I mean, that sounds pretty simple, but it's something that I sometimes think we forget. So they're going to go in the direction that they're pointed. So now they drove a lot better there on that when they were all pointed kind of the right direction. And again, that sounds pretty basic and sounds pretty simplistic, but that's really, really important to think about. I think we'll kind of work through our facility just a little bit. How many of you use a tub? Quite a few of you. How many of you use a bud box? How many of you are familiar with the bud box? So the idea of a bud box is using those same different cues. And so one of the kind of the neat things that I think as far as contrasting the differences between a bud box and a tub. So a tub basically takes advantage, and that's kind of Temple Grand's philosophy. The tub takes advantage of that wanting that go around you to use that circular motion, right? And you're able to push them into a curved type facility, right? And so on a well-designed tub will put you in the right place to put the right pressure on them to get them to continue flowing. Bud box, and we'll kind of demonstrate how we use one here. A bud box is generally cheaper to build. Generally, it's basically you can use it with panels or whatever. You don't have a lot of that metal, but it takes a little more skill to operate. You have to be a little more in tune with what you're doing as compared to a tub. So tubs are generally more expensive but easier to operate versus a bud box is they're cheaper to build, but takes a little more skill to operate. So the idea of a bud box is we're going to bring these cattle into here. We're going to bring them right through these gates. They're going to hit the end of this gate. By that time, I should have the gate behind them closed. They'll hit this fence, and then I'm going to try to be in position about right here to where I can control that flow going in. We talked about problems that sometimes you have in feeding cattle. What do you think causes the greatest problems in going into a race or lead up? In your experience, I think we've all probably been there. It's having too many cattle in there. You should really put only as many cattle as will fit in your lead up at a time. You know, especially on tubs, the tendency is I think we'll be quicker if we put more cattle in there. We try to get them pushed up in there. So what happens when you have too many in there? Once you fill your race up or your lead up, those cattle in front don't have anywhere to go. And so what do they naturally do? They turn around on you. And then all of a sudden they're facing the wrong direction to try to go in there. And so I don't have a preference for either system, for a tub or a bud box. I've had good luck with both. But again, it goes back to that skill of that operator and how they do that, how they use that. So you want to take just a quick little break, and then we'll come back and we'll work these cattle through a bud box? Or do you want to just keep going? Take a little coffee break, come back in about 15 minutes. A little warm, you can cool off.